Have you ever struggled with how to be vulnerable in your writing without crossing a line? Well, good news. Today's episode is going to give you a solution. The bad news? You're going to have to talk about your mistakes because even the mistake you regret the most is storytelling. I'm Jonathan Jordan, your storytelling coach, and this is Everything is Storytelling, a podcast for people obsessed with story. All right, welcome back to Everything is Storytelling, a podcast for people obsessed with story. I'm going to kick off today's episode real quick with a little bit of an apology because publishing episodes lately, for those of you who have been listening since the beginning, it's been a little spotty, and that is totally my fault, at least for the most part. I've had several things come up recently that have kind of thrown me a bit off schedule, plus some technical issues with recording the podcast that I had to get resolved. So I think we have those fixed finally, and now I can get back on a schedule. But we're going to be picking up our series about the 5 story types today, and we're going to be getting into the 4th story type, which is mistake lesson stories. So I see this come up probably at least once a week, where someone will engage with my content and they'll say something to the effect of, I really struggle with vulnerability. I'm worried about crossing a line. I'm worried about saying too much. I'm worried that people are going to perceive this as a weakness. They're not going to hire me. And there's just a lot of fear around this idea of vulnerability and how to be authentic in terms of sharing your mistakes. So today, when we talk about mistake lesson stories, it's going to give you a framework for how you can be vulnerable, but in a way that is constructive. And so, for those of you who have read my book, Start with Story, if you haven't yet, you can go grab it on Amazon. But for those of you who've read it, you already know that one of my favorite expressions to use is that you should be an open book, not an open wound. Open books instruct, open wounds infect. Okay, so let's dive in a little bit deeper with what mistake lesson stories look like. Or if you prefer, sometimes I like to call these silver lining narratives because that's ultimately what they are. So some authors that I work with, they are worried about sharing too much. And we talked about that a little bit with problem solution stories, how a lot of times authors feel like they need to hold something back because if they give away all their knowledge, then why would anyone ever hire them? Well, there's a similar concern here with what about sharing my mistakes? If I share my mistakes, people are going to not believe I can do my job well. They're not going to hire me. Ultimately, they're afraid that they're going to look weak to their audience. They're fearful that being vulnerable means they're going to be undermining their own credibility with their audience. However, what I found over and over again is that vulnerability is absolutely the best tool that you can use for developing trust and credibility with your audience. And that's why mistake lesson stories are going to be so powerful for you in your content. Okay. So I'm just going to put the cards on the table here. Sometimes I feel like my whole life is a bit of a silver lining narrative. I'm actually a natural pessimist and I tend to be a professional looker backer. And so when I look back at my life, a lot of times I can only see the mistakes. Yes, there are some notable exceptions, like meeting and marrying my wife and adopting our 2 incredible boys. So I'm not saying I only see the dismal stuff, but I tend to have a lot of regrets. I tend to look at the mistakes I've made and wish I could go back. Okay. So I'm going to share what might be the biggest professional mistake that I have ever made. So we're going to hit the rewind button. We're going to go back to 2018 for a moment. And in 2018, the year started off awesome because I won a screenwriting competition, a pretty big one, actually. And I got invited out to Hollywood and I got to have a bunch of meetings. And I actually, on my birthday, no less, I ended up signing with one of the biggest talent agencies in the business. It was incredible. I actually kind of felt a little bit like I was in a movie. And so I felt like here I am. I am on the cusp of making it in Hollywood, something I've dreamed about for most of my life at that point. Okay. And, a few months went by and not a whole lot had happened. But then in September of the same year, I had an opportunity pop up that my agent brought me of an indie production company that was looking for a writer for their movie. And it was exactly the type of movie that was in my vein, in my interest. I interviewed with them. A couple weeks later, I found out, boom, I got the job. Okay. So here I am. I'm feeling pretty great about things. I just got hired to write this movie. So now I'm a professional screenwriter, not just doing it as a hobby, if you will. And so I fly out to LA because I need to do some research for the script. I need to meet with the producers. While I'm in town, I'm going to take some other meetings. Okay. And one of the meetings that I'm taking is with one of the largest studios in the world at the time of this trip, that is. In fact, it was quite literally my dream to one day write a movie for this studio. Now, I'd already had a couple other phone meetings with the studio and with one specific person there who my script had come across their desk. And even though they didn't want to make that script into a movie, they liked my work and wanted to at least keep having conversations with me at the time. Okay. So this meeting was really just kind of a general, hey, let's actually meet in person, face to face. It wasn't supposed to be anything too serious, but when I sat down with my contact about 10 minutes into the meeting, she said something I was not expecting at all. She says, hey, you know what? We actually have a project that's in the pipeline and you could be a good fit for it. What would you think about writing the third installment of X franchise? And so she dropped the name of the franchise. And I'm not going to lie, the question took me by total surprise. I wasn't expecting this at all. And now here is where I made the mistake that I've had to live with every day ever since. I ended up turning it down. Okay, so let's hit the pause button for a second. You might be wondering, why in the world would you turn down an opportunity from a studio that you just said it's your dream to write a movie for them? Okay. Well, for starters, I let fear get in the way. I was afraid that if I said yes, then I wasn't going to be able to effectively handle the other script that I was already committed to because we were still fairly early on in the process. Also, I hadn't seen all of the movies in this franchise. And so I thought, am I really the right person for this? So, yeah, some good old imposter syndrome cropping up. Okay. Now, these thoughts were totally ridiculous for a number of different reasons. And at the very least, I should have said, hey, can I have a little bit more time? And I also should have said, wow, this is an amazing opportunity. I need to rewatch that franchise. Like, you've really got me excited. I should have said, hey, what are you thinking about? What's the timeline for this? Like, there were so many other questions I should have asked because she wasn't even offering me a contract at that moment. She was just offering me the opportunity for interest. So there wasn't even a guarantee I was going to get hired for it. But here's the deal. If you don't say yes to an opportunity, you definitely don't get hired for it. So I didn't think about any of this in the moment. I just said, oh man, thanks for thinking of me, but I think I'm going to have to pass. And then from there, the conversation, we continued to talk about some of my other ideas, and there were some other things that she did want me to pursue. And so it still was a productive meeting, but I said no to an opportunity that I should have at least asked more questions about. So within a year, that contact that I had at the major studio, she ended up leaving to go start her own company, and we lost contact, and no one else there knew me from Adam. Okay. So it wasn't like there was someone else I could email or pick up the phone and say, hey, remember these ideas that I pitched to you? Those opportunities were just gone now. And then the first movie that I was working on, well, it ended up running into some production problems. I'm not going to rehash all of that here for time's sake, but the investors for the movie, they started dropping out. And then when COVID came along in March of 2020, it totally just killed the whole project. And all of a sudden, that movie just wasn't going to happen at all. So yeah, here I am. I lost this opportunity. The studio went on to hire a different screenwriter to pen the script. They actually just pretty recently announced that the movie is actually in production. Because there for a few years, I kind of consoled myself with the idea that, well, they haven't done anything with that script, so maybe I didn't really lose anything. But now the movie is going to be coming out, and it's got two Oscar winners in it. Like, it would have been an incredible opportunity if I had just asked more questions. And here's the deal. Like, even if the movie had never gotten made, at the very least, I would have been paid for the script, which would have been pretty substantial. And more importantly, I would have had my foot in the door with the studio for other big name projects to come along. But I missed my chance, and I have no one to blame but me, myself, and I. So I learned a really painful, I'm not going to lie, it still stings quite a bit, really painful but valuable lesson. Ask more questions. Don't give an immediate answer. Talk it over with other people first, especially, your agent. That should have been number one. So this is a problem story that has no solution. I don't have any kind of twist ending about how I pivoted everything and then sealed a deal. I don't have any kind of conclusion of the studio contact reaching back out to me to make a movie together with her new company. None of that. Okay. And honestly, it's completely possible that this one mistake totally derailed and delayed my screenwriting career. However, it does make a damn good silver lining narrative, because the silver lining is that when everything fell apart, when I realized how big of a mistake I had actually made, what it did was it made me more focused on editing books and learning how to edit books. So I learned how to make wiser decisions in my writing business. I learned how to ask better questions. I learned how to have conversations with people before making snap decisions. And the situation taught me a really important business lesson, which is that there's nothing wrong with having more than one writing project at once. I don't know why I ever thought that I could only just have one thing going, right? Instead, you want to be busy because that's what increases your demand. It increases your value for the business. So next time around, this massive mistake that I made is going to help keep me from making other massive mistakes. And I hope it keeps you from making massive mistakes. So let's bring this back around to your vulnerability and your storytelling. When you are tapping into your inner storyteller, you don't want to just share your successes. Okay. You want to share your failures too. You want to share the mistakes that maybe you're even a little embarrassed to admit. I'm not going to lie, this story is still really embarrassing to me, and it's been kind of difficult to sit down and make myself record this. But alongside those successes or those mistakes rather, you've got to share what you learned from those mistakes. Because teaching others what you learned is just as valuable as providing a solution. You're going to end up saving someone else from making the same mistake. Also, here's the real kicker: you build rapport between you and your audience. When you're brave enough to be vulnerable, they end up trusting you more. They empathize with you and they say, hey, here's someone I could see doing business with. In fact, I worked on a book this past year where the author shared a similar story with me about an international deal he was doing. He sat down with some German business people, and they started discussing this potential deal. And about, 10, 15 minutes into the dinner, they actually asked him to share a story about his biggest failure. And I think a lot of people in that situation, they would have been tempted to say, like, oh, I haven't really had any major failures. Like everything I touch is gold. But he actually took them up on it and said, yeah, let me tell you about my business that completely and utterly failed. And then he shared what he learned from it. And he said that that was kind of their test. They wanted to see whether he would actually be honest with them, whether he would actually share a mistake. And they ended up doing this big deal together. So he was a living example that this type of storytelling, it absolutely works. So, mistake lesson stories, they have this rare and powerful way of building trust between you and your audience. And look, if someone chooses not to work with you because you were honest about your mistakes, then you probably haven't really lost anything. What you've done is you've probably avoided a client who has unrealistic expectations, someone who is going to demand perfection, even though they're not perfect either. Okay. So sharing your mistakes and what you've learned from them attracts high caliber people with high caliber ideas. So the problem and what you need to avoid is when you are sharing mistakes without the lessons. That's where you're going to get yourself into trouble. But as long as you pair them up together, mistake and lesson, and as long as it is a mistake that you have at least substantially healed from to where you can talk about it in a helpful way, well, then you've got that silver lining narrative. You've got a story that to some degree is worth celebrating. Okay. So it really is kind of interesting how mistake lesson stories can open up opportunities for you, kind of like they did with my client and the business leaders. Okay. So in my book, I talk about this story where one of my very first clients, actually, she was my first paying client. She was struggling with how to reconcile the difficult parts of her story with the good parts of her story. And so she told me, she said, I always felt like my life had been a fairy tale. And then as I grew up and I started to feel these new emotions about my past, and as I started to grapple with this latent trauma I had had, it really kind of shattered that illusion of the fairy tale. And I said to her, well, wait a second, but fairy tales have dragons. And her eyes kind of lit up when I said that. She was like, oh my gosh, you're right. Fairy tales have dragons. They're not fairy tales without the struggle. Okay. So, mistake lesson stories, silver lining narratives, they're about slaying the dragon, the mistake. You recognize that the fairy tale's only possible because the dragon showed up. Your story, whatever has happened to you in your life, it may be littered with dragons. I understand. I get that. So is mine. But the dragons do make your story more powerful. The dragons are what make the fairy tale beautiful. So don't hide your dragons because they're actually sleeping on mounds of treasure. By sharing your mistakes, you get to slay the dragons and you get to bring the treasure out into the light because the lessons you learn along the way are the greatest treasure of all. So I hope this episode has been an encouragement for you. If you're like me and you tend to look back with regrets at the mistakes that you've made, look at those as opportunities for storytelling. Look at those as opportunities for you to be able to connect with your audience. We actually can change the world one story at a time.